The courtroom was unusually quiet for a Monday morning. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only sound that could be heard over the soft shuffle of papers and the murmurs of attorneys preparing their cases. It was supposed to be a routine case, a simple matter that wouldn't even make the local news. But that all changed the moment Clint Eastwood stepped through the door. The room went silent. The judge, a stern woman with sharp features and glasses perched low on her nose, glanced up from her paperwork. Her gaze shifted to Clint, who stood in the doorway, his silver hair neatly combed, his face as stoic as ever. Dressed in a tailored black suit, he looked more like a man about to walk onto a Hollywood set than someone who had any business in a courtroom. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge began, her voice tinged with disbelief. "What exactly are you doing here?" She didn't even bother to hide the condescension in her tone. Clint's reputation preceded him. He was a former Secret Service agent, now long retired. But in Hollywood, he was known for playing tough, no-nonsense characters. So when he walked into this courtroom, there was more than a little bit of skepticism. The courtroom erupted in a few scattered chuckles, some of the younger lawyers whispering behind their hands. They were all waiting for Clint to crack a smile, deliver a one-liner, and leave. But Clint didn't smile. Instead, he just stood there, his eyes scanning the room, taking it all in, as if he was waiting for something. The judge, clearly unimpressed, gestured to the chair. "Sit down, Mr. Eastwood. We don't have all day." Clint took a slow step forward, then another. He wasn't in a hurry. His movements were deliberate, as though he was calculating every action. Finally, he reached the witness stand and looked the judge directly in the eye. There was no humor in his gaze, only a calm, steely resolve. "I'm not here for a movie, Judge," Clint said, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. "I'm here because I've got business to take care of." The room, previously filled with quiet chuckles, suddenly fell dead silent. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unamused. "Business? And you thought this was the place for it?" she asked, crossing her arms. Clint didn't respond immediately. Instead, his fingers brushed the inside of his jacket, and he pulled something out. It gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his old U.S. Secret Service badge. There was a collective gasp in the room. The judge blinked once, then again, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The badge didn't look fake. It wasn't the kind of thing anyone would bring to a courtroom as a joke. Clint placed it on the stand between them, his hand lingering for just a second too long. "That's right," Clint said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not just some actor playing a role. I'm Clint Eastwood, and I have unfinished business with someone in this room." The judge's expression changed instantly. Her eyes narrowed. "Is this some kind of stunt, Mr. Eastwood? Because I will not tolerate this kind of disruption." She slammed the gavel down with authority, but the room was frozen. Everyone stared at Clint, unsure of how to react. The laughter that had filled the room moments before died away completely. Clint's gaze swept the room, and the audience felt it, the weight of his presence. He wasn't playing a part. This wasn't a scene from one of his movies. This was real. He stood tall, unyielding, as the judge considered her next move. For a brief moment, she hesitated, unsure of whether she should order him to leave or acknowledge the legitimacy of his badge. "Mr. Eastwood, I don't know who you think you are," the judge began, her voice cool, "but you have no business here. You've disrupted this court, and I am going to have to—" Before she could finish her sentence, a voice came from the back of the room. "You don't want to do that, Judge." Everyone turned. The door to the courtroom had opened, and a figure stepped inside. A man in a sharp black suit, his expression unreadable, walked toward the judge's bench. His name was Thomas Kane, a federal prosecutor who had been known to be more ruthless than any other in his field. His reputation for playing hardball was legendary. "I suggest you listen to Mr. Eastwood," Kane said, his voice calm, but with an edge. "This is no joke." The judge looked at Kane, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Kane didn't wait for her to respond. "Clint, you should know that things have changed. They've been watching you," he said, his words carrying a weight Clint hadn't anticipated. Clint turned toward Kane, his gaze sharp. "Who's they?" "I'm afraid you'll have to figure that out for yourself," Kane replied cryptically. But let me just say, things aren't as they seem. The judge stared at the two men, trying to make sense of what was happening. Her courtroom, her authority, were all slipping out of her control. The tension in the room was palpable. No one moved. Everyone was waiting for the next words to be spoken, the next action to be taken. Then, just as quickly as it began, the moment came to an end. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge finally said, her voice colder now, "you've made your point, but you're still out of order." Clint didn't flinch. He had expected this, but there was something else, a new feeling, something he hadn't felt in years, a deep, gnawing unease. The case he had come to settle was bigger than just his reputation. There was something going on, and Clint was about to find out just how far the rabbit hole went. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood had always been more than the tough, silent man that moviegoers loved to watch on the big screen. But few knew the real Clint. His story was one of sacrifice, danger, and choices that had haunted him for years. Behind the stoic eyes and weathered face, there was a man who had once given everything for a country that never truly understood him. It wasn't always this way. There was a time when Clint had been just another young man with a dream of making a difference. He had joined the U.S. Secret Service straight out of college, a promising recruit with sharp instincts and a quiet determination. He didn't fit the typical mold of the agent in a suit. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't political, but he was deadly effective. For years, Clint operated undercover, protecting some of the nation's most powerful people. He had witnessed the darker side of the world, hidden behind closed doors. Corruption, betrayal, deception, and all of it had weighed on him, slowly chipping away at the man he had once been. He had seen things most people would never believe, things that were better left buried. But as Clint climbed the ranks within the Secret Service, things began to change. He had become too good at his job. His ability to blend into any situation and take down threats with surgical precision had earned him respect, though it also made him a target. One mission, in particular, changed everything. It had been an assignment that Clint would never forget. A high-stakes operation that involved the protection of an international diplomat. A mission so classified that only a handful of agents were involved. But something went horribly wrong. The diplomat had been targeted, and Clint had barely escaped with his life. Worse yet, the mission had been compromised from the inside. A betrayal that Clint could never fully understand. After that, Clint had walked away from the Secret Service. He couldn't stay. The lines between right and wrong had blurred, and the trust he once had in his colleagues had been shattered. The world he had known, the one where loyalty was sacred, had crumbled around him. He was left with nothing but the memories of his friends, who had been lost in the same operation, and the burning need for answers. Now, years later, Clint had returned. But not for a reunion or to relive the past. He had come back because there were things left unfinished, things he couldn't ignore. The very people he had once trusted had gone silent, and Clint knew that meant something was wrong. The conspiracy he had barely escaped was reaching its long arm once again, and it had dragged him back into the chaos. Sitting in the courtroom, Clint couldn't help but feel a familiar weight in the pit of his stomach. He had walked away from all of it. His life as an agent, his identity as a protector, but the truth always had a way of finding him. And now, it seemed, that truth had come calling. As he stared at the judge, a rush of old memories flooded his mind. The faces of his fallen colleagues, the fear in their eyes as they realized they had been betrayed. Clint had never been able to shake the feeling that they hadn't died in vain. There had been something much larger at play, something more sinister than anyone could have known. And now, it was coming after him. He glanced at the federal prosecutor, Thomas Kane. Clint had known Kane from his time with the Secret Service. Kane had been a rising star back then, sharp, ruthless, but ultimately someone Clint could trust. At least, that was what he had believed. But now, with everything that had happened, Clint wasn't so sure. Kane had always been ambitious. In a world where trust was a rare commodity, ambition was often the one thing that kept people alive. But ambition also made people dangerous, and Clint knew better than most that the path Kane had chosen might lead him to be a pawn, or worse, a player, in a game far bigger than anyone could imagine. Clint's attention snapped back to the present. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him. It was a familiar sensation, one he had experienced countless times during his undercover days. But this wasn't a routine mission. This wasn't a scene from one of his movies. This was real. And if Clint didn't act fast, the people who had once been his allies would be his enemies, and they wouldn't stop until they had destroyed everything he had worked for. Mr. Eastwood, the judge's voice cut through his thoughts. You have a lot of explaining to do. Clint didn't respond immediately. He wasn't here to explain himself to anyone. He was here to find out why they had dragged him back into this mess. But one thing was clear. If he didn't take control of the situation now, he would lose the chance to find the answers he had been searching for. Answers that were buried deep, in a place that only a select few knew existed. His fingers tapped lightly on the surface of the witness stand. The badge he had placed there, a simple token of his past, was a reminder of who he used to be. But Clint wasn't interested in the past anymore. The past had failed him. It had betrayed him. It was time for Clint Eastwood to do what he did best. Face the enemy head-on and make them regret underestimating him. The judge, still skeptical, turned her attention to Kane. The prosecutor stood tall, his face unreadable. He was playing his cards close to his chest, and Clint knew better than to trust him. He had been in this position before, surrounded by people who would turn on him without hesitation. But Kane was the key. If he could get to the bottom of this, he might be able to uncover the truth before it was too late. The courtroom was still, the tension thick in the air. Every person in the room was waiting for Clint to speak, waiting for him to break the silence. But Clint didn't rush. He never had. When the time came, he would act. And when he did, no one would see it coming. Let's get one thing straight, Judge, Clint finally said, his voice low but firm. I'm not here for you. I'm not here for anyone but myself. This isn't just about me. This is about all of us. If we don't get to the bottom of this, none of us will make it out alive. The room fell silent. No one knew what to say. The stakes were higher than anyone had realized, and Clint was just beginning to pull at the threads of a mystery that could bring down everything. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Everyone was waiting, holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Clint Eastwood had thrown the first punch, metaphorically speaking, and now the room was in shock. No one had expected him to drop a bombshell like that. I'm not here for you, Clint had said. The words hung in the air, charged with a gravity that sent ripples through the room. The judge, still taken aback, narrowed her eyes, trying to regain control of the situation. The prosecutor, Thomas Kane, had remained eerily quiet. Clint had expected this. Kane was never one to rush into things, especially not in front of an audience. He was the type to sit back, watch, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. Clint knew that Kane's silence was as dangerous as any threat. The judge slammed her gavel down, signaling for order. Mr. Eastwood, you are in contempt of this court, she said, her voice shaking with controlled anger. If you don't explain yourself immediately, I will have you escorted out. Clint remained unfazed. His face was a mask of calm. He knew how this would play out. The judge would throw him out. The prosecutor would stay quiet, watching from the sidelines. But that wasn't his concern. His mission was clear. Find out who was behind the operation that had cost him so much. And he was willing to burn every bridge if that's what it took. I'm not here to play by your rules, Judge, Clint replied coolly, his voice carrying through the room like a blade cutting through thick air. I'm here to get answers. And if I have to rattle a few cages to get them, then that's what I'll do. The judge's face darkened, but before she could respond, the door to the courtroom opened with a creak. Everyone turned, and in walked a man Clint had hoped to never see again. Agent Jason Harris, the very person who had been part of the mission that had gone south years ago. Clint had been certain that Harris was dead, another casualty of a betrayal that had haunted him for years. But there he was, alive, standing at the door as if he'd never left. Harris was tall, with broad shoulders and a square jaw that hadn't changed since Clint had last seen him. His hair was darker now, streaked with gray at the temples. He had always been a hard man, but this time, There was something different about him, a weariness in his eyes that Clint couldn't quite place. "Clint," Harris said, his voice low but steady, "you shouldn't be here." The words were like a punch to Clint's gut. He hadn't expected Harris to show up, especially not in the middle of a case. But there he was, a ghost from the past. Clint's heart raced, his mind spinning as he tried to piece together what was going on. "Jason," Clint replied, his voice hard, "why don't you tell me what's going on? What's the real reason you're all here?" Harris stepped forward, his eyes briefly meeting the judge's before he spoke again. "It's not what you think, Clint. This isn't some random case. You're in the middle of something much bigger than you realize." Clint's mind was already racing. "How much bigger?" Harris hesitated, then gave a slight shake of his head. "I can't explain it here. Not in front of them." He gestured toward the room of onlookers, lawyers, the judge, even the reporters who had begun scribbling notes, now more intrigued than ever. Clint's gaze hardened. "Then where can you explain it?" "Follow me," Harris said, before turning on his heel and walking toward the back door. Clint didn't waste a second. He stood up, his movements smooth and deliberate, and without a word to anyone in the courtroom, he followed Harris. The judge, clearly livid, banged her gavel once more. "Mr. Eastwood, I will have you arrested if you don't return to your seat." But Clint didn't turn back. He couldn't afford to. There were too many unanswered questions, and every second spent here was another second wasted. His eyes were fixed on Harris's back as they made their way down a narrow hallway, past the rooms where jurors waited and the quiet offices of the court staff. Finally, they reached an empty office. Harris closed the door behind them and gestured for Clint to sit. The room was dimly lit, and Clint's eyes immediately locked onto the worn leather chair across from him. He didn't sit down. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for Harris to speak. Harris took a deep breath and sat behind the desk, his fingers tapping lightly against the wooden surface. "Clint, I know this is a lot to take in, but the mission we were on, it wasn't just about protecting that diplomat. There's so much more to it than you could ever imagine." Clint's mind raced. "What are you saying?" "Everything we thought we knew was a lie," Harris continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The operation, the people we were working with, they weren't who we thought they were. There's a shadow organization, one that's been pulling the strings for years. And now, they're coming for us. They know we know too much." Clint's stomach churned. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed from Harris, someone who had been right there beside him, felt like a punch in the gut. He couldn't believe it, but at the same time, he knew it to be true. "This isn't over, Clint," Harris said, his eyes now darting to the door as if someone might overhear them. "You have to get out of town. They'll come after you, and they won't stop until they finish what they started." Clint shook his head. "I'm not running. Not again. If they want me, they'll have to come for me. And when they do, I'll be ready." Harris didn't argue. He knew Clint well enough to understand that once he made up his mind, nothing would change it. "Just be careful," he warned. "You're in deeper than you think." As Clint turned to leave, his mind was already working through his options. There was no going back now. The pieces were all in place, and the only thing left to do was find out who was behind it all and stop them before they could do any more damage. The courtroom was a distant memory now, a backdrop to the bigger game that had just begun. Clint Eastwood hadn't been in the city long before he realized that every shadow held a secret, and every corner seemed to hide a set of eyes watching his every move. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following him, even though he hadn't seen any concrete signs. Harris's warning echoed in his mind. "You're in deeper than you think." The past few hours had been a blur. After leaving the courthouse, Clint had gone to his apartment, if you could call it that. It wasn't much, just a place to sleep and lay low. There was nothing luxurious about it, just the bare essentials. A couch, a table, a small kitchen, and a few framed photos that seemed like they belonged to a different life. A life before Clint had become a man constantly looking over his shoulder. He sat now at the worn wooden table, the dim light from the single overhead bulb casting shadows across the room. His thoughts were racing. Harris had given him no clear answers, only more questions. The shadow organization, the secret betrayal. It all felt like something ripped straight out of one of Clint's old spy thrillers, except this time, it was real. Too real. Clint ran his hand over his face, exhaustion creeping in. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew he couldn't keep fighting this battle alone. He needed allies. But who could he trust? That's when his phone rang, breaking through the silence of the room. The ringtone was old, an odd choice for someone trying to stay off the grid. But Clint wasn't exactly in a position to care about his choice of music. He glanced at the screen. The name that flashed was one he hadn't seen in years, Sarah Mitchell. A pang of recognition hit him, and for a split second, the weight of his past lifted. Sarah had been more than just a colleague in the early days of Clint's career. She had been his partner, his confidant. They had been through hell together, protecting foreign dignitaries, covering for each other when things went wrong. But after the fallout from the mission, Sarah had disappeared from his life, just like everyone else he had once cared about. Sarah? Clint answered, his voice cautious but relieved. I didn't expect to hear from you. A soft laugh echoed on the other end of the line. I can't say I expected to call you, Clint. But it looks like we're both in the same mess now, aren't we? Clint's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized just how much he'd missed hearing her voice until now. Despite the years that had passed, her presence on the phone felt strangely comforting. What mess are you talking about? Clint asked, pushing aside his personal feelings and focusing on the conversation at hand. Sarah's voice dropped to a more serious tone. It's happening again. The people we thought were in charge. Turns out they weren't the ones pulling the strings. There's a new player in town, Clint, and they're not playing by the rules. Clint's mind was spinning. He'd already suspected as much, but hearing Sarah confirm it sent a chill down his spine. The last time he had seen her, she had been working a different case, one that had been deemed too dangerous for the team. She'd pulled out of the operation after they lost a few key agents, and Clint had never heard from her again. What are you talking about? Who are they? Clint asked urgently, pushing Sarah for answers. I don't have all the details yet, she replied, but I've been tracking some suspicious activity, movements of high-level officials, covert operations. They've been making moves behind closed doors for months, maybe longer. Clint's fists clenched. He had seen the destruction caused by these kinds of shadow operations. If there were new players involved, it meant things were far worse than he had feared. Where are you now? He asked, his voice more intense. I'm not far from you, Sarah said. But Clint, this is bigger than just you and me. These people know how to cover their tracks. If they suspect we're onto them, we'll be dead before the end of the week. Clint stood up, moving towards the window and peering out into the darkened streets below. His instincts were telling him that he couldn't afford to wait any longer. He needed to move, to confront whatever it was that was lurking in the shadows. But he also needed Sarah. She was the one person who might know more about the people behind the curtain, people who had managed to slip under the radar for so long. I need you to meet me, Sarah. Tonight, Clint said, his voice a low growl. I'm not doing this without you. Sarah was silent for a moment, and Clint could almost hear the wheels turning in her mind. He knew how much she hated working with him again, how much she had hated the life they left behind. But she also knew that when Clint Eastwood called, it wasn't something she could ignore. I'll be there, Sarah finally said, and Clint heard the familiar edge in her voice. She wasn't just agreeing to meet. She was ready for the fight. But we need a plan. This isn't just about us anymore. The whole damn city could be at risk. Clint nodded, even though he knew she couldn't see him. I'll be waiting. Don't be late. After hanging up, Clint took a moment to collect his thoughts. He was walking into something he didn't fully understand, but he knew one thing for sure. Sarah's return to the picture meant the beginning of something bigger. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but Clint still didn't know who the players were, or what their endgame was. He grabbed his jacket, checking his gun one last time. The night was just beginning, and Clint had a feeling that whatever was coming next would test him in ways he couldn't predict. As Clint stepped out of his apartment, the streets felt eerily quiet. But he wasn't alone, not anymore. Sarah was out there, and together, they would face whatever storm was coming. But with every step Clint took, the weight of what was at stake pressed heavier on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for everyone's. Clint hadn't been on the move like this in years. The city streets, once so familiar to him, now seemed like a labyrinth, each turn more uncertain than the last. Sarah had been right to warn him. It wasn't just the two of them anymore. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than anything they'd ever faced. They weren't simply tracking down rogue agents or infiltrating corrupt officials. This was something far more sinister. They had agreed to meet in a small, dimly lit diner on the edge of town. The kind of place where nobody would ask questions. The kind of place where secrets were easy to exchange over a cup of coffee. Clint arrived first, slipping into a corner booth where he had a clear view of the door. The bell above the door jingled as it swung open, and a figure stepped inside. Sarah. She looked exactly as Clint remembered. Strong, confident, but with the same haunted look that had stayed with her since the mission went south. She hadn't aged much, but the years had definitely marked her. Her eyes held the same fire, but there was a quiet sorrow behind them now, one that Clint could understand all too well. "Clint," Sarah said softly as she slid into the booth across from him, her eyes scanning the room, ever vigilant. "It's good to see you, but I wish it were under better circumstances." Clint nodded, his gaze shifting to the door once more before settling on her. "We're in deeper than we thought, Sarah. What's going on? What's the real play here?" Sarah's face grew serious as she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "The organization behind this, they've been operating in the shadows for years. They're not just after you, Clint. They're after anyone who's ever been in the know. Anyone who's ever seen the truth about what's really going on." Clint's mind began to race again, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together. Who are they? What's their goal? Sarah glanced around one more time before continuing. "I don't know all the details, but I've been following the movements of certain officials. They're high up, real high. They're not just working within the government. They've infiltrated every part of it. Military, intelligence, law enforcement. They've put their people everywhere, Clint." Clint's fists clenched at the thought of someone pulling the strings behind the scenes. He had fought for so long, following orders, doing what needed to be done. Now, he was learning that the very system he had fought to protect had been compromised. It was like being punched in the gut. "So, they're everywhere," Clint said, his voice low. "And we're next." Sarah nodded, her eyes dark with concern. "It's not just about us. They're making moves, Clint. They're setting up something big, something that could change everything. And we're the only ones who know enough to stop them." Clint took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The weight of what they were up against was heavy. But this wasn't the time for fear. This was the time for action. "We need more information," Clint said, his voice determined. "We need to find out who's running this operation and what their plan is." Sarah hesitated, her eyes flickering with doubt. "I've been digging, but the deeper I go, the more dangerous it gets. We're not the only ones interested in these people. There's another player in the game." Clint's brow furrowed. "Another player? Who?" "I don't know yet," Sarah replied, her voice tight with frustration. "But whoever they are, they've got resources, and they're tracking everything we do. I barely managed to cover my tracks last time, but this time, I'm not so sure." Clint stared at her for a moment, trying to gauge the depth of her concern. He could see it now. Sarah wasn't just afraid of the organization they were hunting. She was afraid of someone else, someone she hadn't named. "Who else is out there, Sarah?" Clint asked, his voice quieter now, more insistent. But before she could respond, the door to the diner opened with a loud crash, and in strode two men, dressed in black suits. Their eyes scanned the room quickly before locking onto Clint and Sarah. Clint's heart skipped a beat. It was clear these men weren't just another pair of curious diners. They were here for something. Someone? Sarah's hand shot to her jacket, and Clint followed her lead, instinctively reaching for the small pistol at his side. It was clear now that the meeting was no longer safe. The men were moving toward them quickly, their presence almost suffocating. "Get up," Clint muttered, his voice sharp as he slid out of the booth. "We need to move now." Sarah didn't hesitate. She stood up with him, but the men were closing in fast. They didn't have much time. Clint grabbed Sarah's wrist, pulling her toward the back exit, the sound of their footsteps heavy on the floor as they rushed through the diner's narrow hallway. He glanced over his shoulder, but the two men were right behind them. They weren't going to let them get away this time. As they burst out into the alley behind the diner, Clint's mind raced. He had to think fast. There was no way they could outrun these men, at least not without getting caught. "Where's the car?" Clint shouted. "It's parked a few blocks down," Sarah replied, breathless as they ran. "But we can't go straight there. They'll be waiting." Clint cursed under his breath. They needed to lose their pursuers. He scanned the alley ahead, looking for anything that could help them shake off the tail. That's when he spotted it, a narrow side street that led to a dead end. "We'll take that way," Clint said. "Stick close." As they rounded the corner, Clint's heart raced. They had to outsmart these men, or they would be caught. But Clint wasn't about to let that happen. Not now. Not when they were this close to finding the answers. But even as they ran, Clint knew one thing for sure. They were being hunted. And they weren't just running from anyone. These men were connected to the people behind the plot they were trying to expose. They were part of the game, and it was only just beginning. The night had descended quickly, wrapping the city in a blanket of darkness. Clint and Sarah were no longer just running. They were racing against time. Every alley they turned down seemed to only lead to another dead end. The two men in black suits were relentless, gaining on them with every step. Clint's mind was sharp, his instincts honed from years of experience in the field. But this situation was different. He had never been in this kind of game before. The stakes were higher, the players more dangerous, and the consequences of failure far worse than anything he had faced in his past. "Keep moving," Clint hissed, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they hadn't lost their pursuers. They hadn't. They darted into another narrow street, hoping to lose the men in the maze of old warehouses and industrial buildings. The dim glow of streetlights barely penetrated the heavy shadows, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Sarah was already breathing heavily, but she didn't complain. They had no time to waste. Clint could tell she was thinking ahead, her sharp mind already analyzing their options. They needed to find a way out of this before they were trapped. "Clint," Sarah whispered, glancing at him as they slowed down, trying to keep their steps as quiet as possible. "We need to split up." Clint's eyes shot to her, disbelief flashing across his face. "Are you crazy? They'll pick us off one by one." "They're already on us," Sarah said, her voice low and urgent. "We're too easy to follow right now. If we stay together, they'll corner us in no time. But if we split up, we might have a chance to lose them." Clint hesitated. The plan didn't sit well with him, but he knew she was right. They couldn't keep running straight into danger. Splitting up might be their only shot. "Fine," Clint muttered, "but we meet up again in 1 hour. Don't take longer." "Got it." "Got it," Sarah nodded. With one last glance, they parted ways, disappearing into the maze of streets, each with their own escape route in mind. Clint's heart hammered in his chest as he moved quickly, trying to shake off the men chasing them. The silence of the night was broken only by the sound of his heavy breathing and the distant footsteps of their pursuers. He stayed low, weaving through alleyways and ducking behind dumpsters and cars, making sure to leave no trace of his movements. The men in black weren't far behind. Clint could hear their footsteps growing louder with each passing second. He needed to get out of the city, to get to a place where he could regroup and figure out their next move. But as the minutes ticked by, he realized how little he really knew about what was happening. Who were these men? What were they after? And most importantly, why were they targeting him and Sarah? A shadow flickered to his right, and Clint instinctively spun to face it, his hand already on his gun. But it wasn't one of the men. Instead, a small figure emerged from the shadows. A woman, thin, dressed in all black, with a face hidden behind a scarf. Clint's grip on his weapon tightened, but the woman raised her hands in a gesture of peace. "Not here to hurt you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can help, but you need to trust me." Clint eyed her warily. He wasn't in the habit of trusting strangers, especially not in the middle of a high-stakes chase. But something about her presence made him pause. Maybe it was the calm in her voice, or the way she seemed to know exactly how to avoid detection, but Clint couldn't shake the feeling that she might know something they didn't. "I'm listening," Clint said, lowering his gun slightly but keeping it within reach. The woman glanced over her shoulder, then motioned for Clint to follow her. "We don't have much time. The men you're running from, they're just the tip of the iceberg. You need to know who you're really up against." Clint hesitated, but then decided to follow her. If she was telling the truth, this could be the lead they were looking for. They moved quickly, weaving through the alleyways until they reached a small, unmarked door at the side of an old building. The woman pulled out a key and unlocked the door, ushering Clint inside. The moment Clint stepped through the door, he was hit by the scent of dust and old books. The room was cramped and cluttered, with piles of paperwork and files strewn about, along with a large desk covered in maps, photographs, and blueprints. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding more files, documents, and equipment that looked like it belonged to a long-forgotten operation. "What is this place?" Clint asked, his eyes scanning the room. "This is where I work," the woman replied, closing the door behind him and locking it with a soft click. "I've been tracking the organization that's after you and Sarah. I've got the intel you need, but it's not safe to discuss it out in the open." Clint's suspicion grew, but the woman seemed to know her stuff. She moved to a table and pulled out a folder, placing it in front of him. "These are the people behind the operation. I've been collecting information on them for months." Clint's hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. Photos, names, connections. Each piece of information only added more questions. This wasn't just a rogue operation. It was a network, a web of corruption that stretched across multiple governments, agencies, and corporations. "This isn't just about us, is it?" Clint muttered, realizing the gravity of what they were dealing with. "No," the woman replied grimly. "This is bigger than you and Sarah. This is about control, about creating a new world order. And you're both in the way." Clint stared at the documents, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. There was no turning back now. Whoever was behind this wouldn't stop until they were silenced. But Clint wasn't ready to be anyone's pawn. "You said you could help," Clint said, looking up at the woman. "How?" The woman paused, then gave a small, knowing smile. "We need to take them down from the inside. And I think you're the one to do it." Clint felt a surge of determination. The game had changed. Now, it was time to strike back. But to do that, he'd have to trust someone he barely knew, and take a step into a dangerous world that could swallow him whole. Clint sat at the small table, the folder in front of him feeling heavier by the second. He wasn't sure what to make of the information he'd just uncovered. Names, faces, and connections. The organization hunting him and Sarah wasn't just some rogue faction. It was a global network, operating in the shadows with far-reaching influence. These people had eyes everywhere, inside governments, corporations, and intelligence agencies. They controlled events from behind the scenes, pulling strings and orchestrating chaos. The woman, who had introduced herself as Rachel, watched him carefully, her gaze unreadable. She had been quiet for the past few minutes, allowing Clint to process the information, but he could tell she was waiting for him to ask the right questions. She wasn't just offering help out of kindness. There was something more to her involvement, something she wasn't telling him yet. "You knew all this was going on?" Clint asked, his voice low as he glanced up from the documents. "How long have you been tracking these people?" Rachel didn't immediately answer. Instead, she walked over to a cluttered shelf and pulled down a thick binder. She flipped it open, showing Clint another stack of documents. This one was more personal: photos, dossiers, and surveillance reports. "I've been tracking them for over a year," Rachel said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "I used to work for them, but then I found out too much. They're not who they say they are." Clint felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "You worked for them?" His mind raced. "Then why are you helping us?" Rachel's eyes darkened as she leaned against the table, her arms crossed. "Because I know what they're capable of. I've seen it firsthand. I was part of their operation until I learned about their true goals. They want control, total control. They'll stop at nothing to make sure their agenda goes forward." Clint could sense the weight in her words. Rachel wasn't just a bystander. She had been involved in something dark. He needed to know more. What exactly do they want? What's the endgame? Rachel hesitated for a moment, then sighed deeply, as though carrying the burden of the truth was taking its toll. It's not just about power. They want to manipulate everything. Global politics, economies, even the way people think. They've been setting up operations in every corner of the world, pulling strings, making deals, and erasing anyone who stands in their way. Clint took a breath, absorbing what Rachel had said. So, what does this have to do with me and Sarah? Why us? Rachel pushed the folder across the table, her fingers brushing against the papers as she did. You and Sarah are part of something they didn't plan for. You've seen the cracks in their system, Clint. You've uncovered things you weren't supposed to. That makes you a target. Clint's mind reeled. He'd always known he was in the dark about certain things during his career, but now it was clear. He'd been a pawn in a much bigger game. He wasn't just being hunted because of his skills or his past. He was a threat to an operation that had been years in the making. And Sarah? Clint asked, leaning in. What about her? Rachel's expression softened for a moment. Sarah was always a wild card. She's smarter than they gave her credit for. But she's also emotionally invested in this. That makes her dangerous in ways they didn't anticipate. Clint's thoughts turned to Sarah. She had always been resourceful, sharp, and, above all, fiercely loyal. But what had she gotten herself into? What had they both unknowingly become part of? He couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something much darker than they'd originally believed. You said you used to work for them, Clint continued, narrowing his eyes. What happened? How did you leave? Rachel's lips tightened, and Clint could see the shadow of a painful memory flicker behind her eyes. I was one of their operatives, a field agent, just like you. I did what I was told, never questioning the orders. But then one day, I got close to something I wasn't supposed to. An operation involving human trafficking, and not just any trafficking. High-level people, people who could buy and sell entire governments. When I dug deeper, I found evidence of their involvement in some of the most corrupt deals imaginable. I tried to go to higher authorities, but they had everyone in their pocket. They knew what I was doing before I even made my move. So, I ran. Clint could sense the pain in her voice, but he could also see the determination in her eyes. Rachel wasn't just trying to escape her past. She was trying to atone for it. So, what now? He asked. How do we stop them? Rachel glanced at the papers on the table. We go after the people who run this, the heads of the organization. They're not untouchable, but we need to be careful. They'll have eyes everywhere. The moment we make a move, they'll know. Clint stood up, his fists clenched. I've never been good at waiting. We go after them now. Rachel nodded, understanding the fire in his eyes. We'll need to stay off the radar. We'll have to use everything we know, everything we can, if we're going to have any chance. Before Clint could respond, a sudden noise at the door made him freeze. He motioned for Rachel to stay quiet as he reached for the gun at his side. His heart pounded in his chest as he carefully approached the door, his senses on high alert. With one swift motion, Clint swung the door open. A man stood there, dressed in black, his face shadowed by a hood. I think you're looking for me, the man said coolly, his voice cold and calculating. Clint's heart skipped a beat. Who are you? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. I don't think you want to know. Before Clint could react, the man reached into his jacket and pulled out a device, pressing a button that sent a jolt of electricity coursing through the room. The lights flickered, and everything went dark. The sudden surge of electricity coursing through the room left Clint disoriented. His body seized, muscles locking up as the pulse of energy shot through him. His vision blurred, the sharp edges of reality fading into a dull haze. He could hear Rachel's frantic breathing, but it was as if her voice came from a faraway place. For a moment, the world around him seemed to swirl in slow motion. His body was paralyzed, but his mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The man in the doorway, he wasn't just some random threat. This was coordinated. It was all part of the same tangled web Clint had found himself caught in. The lights flickered again, and then everything went dark. The world around Clint slowly began to come back into focus, though his body still felt sluggish, like moving through thick molasses. He could feel the rough texture of the concrete floor beneath him. His hands fumbled for his weapon, but everything felt distant, like he was underwater. Every sound around him was muffled, every movement lethargic. "Clint." Rachel's voice cut through the haze, soft but panicked. "Clint, are you—" "I'm fine," he rasped, forcing his body to respond. "Stay down." The man was still in the doorway, his silhouette just visible in the dim light, which seemed to flicker with each pulse of energy. Clint's hand finally closed around his gun, but it felt heavier than normal. He had to push against his body's refusal to cooperate. He could barely make out the figure of Rachel in the darkness. The man stepped closer, moving slowly but with a sense of purpose. Clint tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him, giving out beneath him. He fell forward, his hands slamming against the floor for balance, but his vision was still too blurry to focus on anything clearly. The man's voice echoed in the silence, cold and detached. "You're not as clever as you think you are, Clint Eastwood. This whole operation is way above your pay grade." Clint finally found his voice, though it was strained. "Who the hell are you?" His words came out like a rasp. A quiet chuckle reverberated through the room. "You don't need to know who I am, but you're about to learn exactly what you've gotten yourself into." Clint's mind was racing, his thoughts jumbled. The electricity had knocked him off balance, but it hadn't fully incapacitated him. He had to find a way to regain control of the situation. He could still hear Rachel's breath, the quick and shallow gasps of someone equally on edge, and he couldn't afford to let her go down without a fight. With a gritted breath, Clint pushed himself to his knees, still struggling to clear the fog from his brain. "If you think this ends with you walking out of here, you've got another thing coming." The man didn't seem fazed by Clint's words. Instead, he stepped forward, his boots making soft thuds against the floor. Clint instinctively pulled his gun, pointing it shakily in the direction of the figure, but his aim was unsteady. "Do you think your weapon will make any difference?" the man said, almost in amusement. "The moment you fired, I'd already be miles away, Clint." Clint's heart pounded in his chest, a sinking feeling gnawing at him. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't just a random mercenary. He was connected to something far more sinister. The words, "above your pay grade," repeated in his mind, and Clint couldn't shake the idea that this man knew exactly who he was. More troubling was that the man didn't seem to be afraid of Clint's reputation, of Clint's skills. That meant one thing. "Get up, Clint," the man ordered, his voice sharp now. "You're not going anywhere until I say so." Rachel's voice rose from behind him, her tone demanding. "You won't get away with this. Whoever you are, you can't just—" The man snapped his fingers, cutting her off. "I don't need to explain myself. Just know that this isn't your fight anymore. It's too late for that." Clint's mind was whirling. Too late? What the hell did that mean? He couldn't afford to waste any more time thinking. He needed to act. Now, with the last of his strength, Clint surged upward, trying to steady his hand on the gun. He didn't have much leverage, but what he did have was instinct. Before the man could react, Clint fired. The shot echoed through the room, but the man, surprisingly, didn't flinch. Instead, there was a brief, unsettling laugh. "You really think a bullet is going to stop me?" the man taunted. "You're playing in a world you can't even begin to comprehend." Clint's finger tightened on the trigger again, but as the gun discharged, it didn't seem to have any effect. There was no gunshot sound this time, just a dull thud as the bullet slowed unnaturally in the air, like it was being stopped by some unseen force. "What the hell?" Clint muttered under his breath, his eyes widening. The man chuckled again, a deep, knowing sound that sent a chill down Clint's spine. "Did you really think you could take on something like me? You're not the only one with secrets, Clint." Clint's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. This man wasn't just another adversary. He was part of something far beyond Clint's understanding. Someone with abilities Clint couldn't even fathom. Before he could react, the man stepped forward, grabbing Clint by the collar and lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. Rachel gasped behind him, but Clint couldn't focus on her voice, not with the feeling of being completely helpless. The man's cold breath was in his ear now, and Clint could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him from all sides. "Your next move better be a good one, Clint, because if it's not, you'll never see the light of day again. I suggest you listen carefully. You've been warned." Clint's chest heaved as he looked into the man's eyes, the glow of something unnatural flickering behind his pupils. His mind was racing, but his body was still too slow, too sluggish to make a counterattack. In that moment, Clint realized the depth of the trouble they were in. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about getting out alive. And he wasn't sure how much longer he had. Clint's chest was still heaving, and his pulse hammered in his ears as the man's grip tightened around his collar. The cold, calculated look in the man's eyes sent a shiver down Clint's spine, but it wasn't just fear that coursed through him. It was the growing realization that his world had just been upended. He wasn't just dealing with enemies he could fight. He was dealing with a whole different kind of power, and he had no idea how to fight it. "Put me down," Clint growled, trying to break free from the man's grasp. But it was like trying to move a mountain. Every movement was sluggish, and his muscles still hadn't recovered from the electrical shock that had knocked him off balance. The man's lips curled into a smirk, but there was no amusement in it, only disdain. "You're in no position to make demands, Clint." Clint's mind raced, trying to figure out his next move, but everything felt so off. He could feel the man's power radiating through him, and it was clear that Clint had underestimated the situation. This wasn't just about skill or strategy anymore. This was about something bigger, something that Clint didn't understand. Rachel's voice cut through the tension. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded, her tone sharp and angry. "What do you want from us?" The man's eyes flicked to Rachel, but he didn't release his grip on Clint. "I'm just the messenger," he said coolly, "but I think you already know who's behind this." Clint's stomach churned. He didn't need to hear the rest of the man's words to understand what he was implying. The organization they'd been fighting, the one that had been hunting them, wasn't just some rogue faction. It was connected to something far more sinister. And now Clint and Rachel were in the crosshairs of something that was more powerful than they could have imagined. The man's grip on Clint's collar loosened slightly, but only enough to make Clint feel like he was still at the mercy of whatever forces were pulling the strings. "I'm not here to kill you," the man said, his voice almost sympathetic. "But if you keep pushing, I won't hesitate to make sure you don't leave this room alive." Clint swallowed hard, refusing to let fear show. He had to keep control of the situation. Somehow, his gaze flicked to Rachel, who stood frozen, still trying to make sense of everything. He could see the resolve in her eyes, the same kind of determination he felt. They couldn't back down. "Then what do you want from us?" Clint asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The man released a short, humorless laugh. "What do I want? You think this is about me? You really are clueless." Clint felt his patience wearing thin, but he held his tongue, waiting for the man to continue. He wasn't going to make a move until he knew exactly what they were up against. The man's expression darkened, and he leaned in closer, his breath cold against Clint's skin. "You're involved in something much bigger than you think. You and Sarah. Your piece is on a chessboard. And right now, you're in check." Clint's blood ran cold as the man's words sank in. He had known they were in over their heads, but this was a whole new level of danger. Whoever was pulling the strings wasn't just a criminal organization. They were controlling entire systems, and Clint had somehow wandered into their crosshairs. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He and Rachel weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their lives, against an enemy who could manipulate every aspect of the game. "Sarah," Clint said, his mind shifting back to her. "What does she have to do with this?" The man's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You really don't get it, do you? Sarah has something they want. Something you both need to stop them. But it's not going to be easy. Not when they're always one step ahead." Clint's heart pounded harder. "You're talking about something else, something bigger than just a personal vendetta. What is it?" The man didn't answer immediately, but Clint could see the hesitation in his eyes. It was brief, but enough for Clint to catch it. "I can't help you," the man finally said. "I'm not the one you need to worry about. But if you're smart, you'll listen to me." Clint narrowed his eyes. "Why should I listen to you? After everything that's happened? You think you can just waltz in here and—" "Because I know how this ends for you," the man interrupted, his voice suddenly icy. "And you don't want to see it." The words hung in the air, heavy and menacing, like a threat wrapped in a warning. Clint's mind raced. If the man wasn't here to kill them, then what was he here for? What kind of game was he playing? Rachel stepped forward suddenly, her hands clenched at her sides. You think you've got us cornered, don't you? You don't know who you're dealing with. The man's eyes shifted to her, his expression unreadable. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Rachel. The question is, do you? Clint's thoughts spun as Rachel's face paled. It was clear the man knew something about her past, something that shook her. He could see the fear flicker in her eyes, and it made him wonder just how deep this rabbit hole went. He had thought Rachel was on his side, but now it seemed like she, too, was carrying secrets of her own. I don't need to explain myself to you, Rachel said, her voice firm, but there was a slight tremor in it. But if you think for 1 second that you can control us, you're wrong. The man's lips curled again, this time into something that could almost be mistaken for amusement. You're both playing with fire. And trust me, you don't want to get burned. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Clint's mind was a whirlwind of questions, doubts, and strategies. But the most important question remained unanswered. What had they walked into? And how in the hell were they going to get out of it? The weight of the man's words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating any hope of clarity. Clint's mind was running wild, trying to grasp the enormity of what they were dealing with. Whoever this man was, whoever was pulling the strings behind him, they weren't just enemies. They were a force Clint couldn't hope to defeat head-on. Clint and Rachel were standing on the precipice of something much larger than anything they had prepared for. A conspiracy that stretched far beyond their initial skirmishes, far beyond the people they thought they were fighting. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making a choice that would either lead them into deeper danger or could open the door to a solution they had never considered. Listen to me, the man said again, his voice colder now, laced with impatience. I'm not your enemy. I'm trying to keep you both alive. Rachel shot Clint a look that was more conflicted than he had ever seen her. She wanted to believe this man. There was no doubt about it. But Clint wasn't so sure. Every fiber in his being screamed that this was a trap. He had been down this road too many times to take a chance on someone who had already shown them nothing but threats and manipulations. You expect us to just take your word for it? Clint asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. His hand was still wrapped tightly around his gun, though at this point, it felt like an empty gesture. What good was a gun against someone who could stop bullets mid-flight? The man's smirk was almost imperceptible, but Clint saw it, and it only made him more uneasy. No, Clint. I expect you to use your brain. You can keep fighting this, but you'll lose. You're already in deeper than you realize. He paused, his gaze lingering on Rachel for a moment longer than Clint was comfortable with. And you, Rachel, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Rachel's breath hitched, and for a split second, Clint could see the flicker of something vulnerable in her eyes. She wasn't used to being the one who had something to hide, but it was becoming clear that this man knew more about her than even Clint did. The realization was like a punch to the gut. I don't know who you are, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper, but you don't know me. Don't I? The man asked softly. I know you're scared. You should be, because this isn't something you can run from. None of us can. Clint stepped forward, narrowing his eyes at the man, the tension in his muscles coiled tightly. Enough with the riddles. What do you want from us? Why are you here? The man's eyes shifted, the faintest shadow of something dark passing over his face. I'm here because your survival depends on it, and more importantly, your understanding of what's at stake. You think this is about a vendetta. You think it's about me versus you, but it's not. You're just pawns in a much bigger game. Clint's heart pounded as he tried to process everything. Pawns. A bigger game. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about something global, something that could alter the balance of power. The realization sent a chill down his spine. If we're pawns, then who the hell are the kings and queens? Clint asked, his voice hard. The man's expression flickered for a moment, and then he leaned in, lowering his voice to almost a whisper. People you don't want to know. But I'm offering you a chance to be more than just pawns. You can be part of the next stage of this. A stage where you actually have control. Rachel stepped closer to Clint, her face a mixture of doubt and curiosity. "And what do you want in return? What's the catch?" The man looked at her, then back to Clint, his gaze intense. "You'll need to help me. Stop this operation from escalating further. If you don't, you'll be swept up in it, just like everyone else. But if you work with me, if you can put your trust in me, we can make sure that this doesn't end with the world burning." Clint's thoughts were a storm, his mind battling with the instincts he had honed over a lifetime. Trust was a dangerous thing in his world. It could get people killed. But if this man was right, if there were forces moving beyond their control, then Clint didn't have the luxury of ignoring him. "Why should we trust you?" Clint demanded, his voice still skeptical. "You've shown us nothing but threats." The man's eyes darkened. "I don't expect you to trust me," he said. "I expect you to think. Think about what's coming. Think about Sarah. Think about the people you're trying to protect. And then make your choice." There it was again. Sarah? Clint felt his jaw tighten. Everything was tied back to her. Everything that had happened in the last few days, the people they'd lost, the betrayals they'd suffered. It all led back to Sarah. But this was bigger. Sarah wasn't just a pawn. She was the key. The man wasn't lying when he said she had something important. Clint turned to Rachel, his mind racing. What choice did they have? The man had made it clear that they were already in the thick of it, no matter what they did. There was no escaping it. If they didn't play along, they were as good as dead. "I don't like it," Rachel muttered, her voice tinged with frustration, "but I don't see any other option." Clint nodded slowly, his gut telling him they were making a deal with the devil. But it was a deal they had no choice but to make. They needed answers. They needed to understand what they were up against. "All right," Clint said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We're in. But don't think for a second that we're doing this because we trust you. We're doing this because we have no choice." The man's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. You'll need all your wits about you, because things are about to get a whole lot worse before they get better." Clint turned to Rachel, his mind already working on the next steps. They had just agreed to play a dangerous game, and now there was no turning back. The following days felt like they were slipping through Clint's fingers, each moment tainted by the uneasy tension that had settled between him, Rachel, and their new ally. They didn't trust the man. How could they? But they had little choice. The enemy they were up against was far more complex than they had imagined. The stakes weren't just personal anymore. They were global, and Clint had a sickening feeling that the worst was yet to come. Rachel didn't speak much over the next few hours. They both knew they had work to do. After the chilling encounter with their mysterious contact, there was only one thing on Clint's mind: finding out exactly what the hell they were dealing with. They had a lead, a cryptic one, but it was the only thing they had to go on. "We need to get to the warehouse," Clint said, glancing over at Rachel as she finished packing their things. She didn't look up, her eyes focused on her task. "I know." The man said, "It's where we'll find answers. But we're not just walking in there blindly, Clint. We need a plan." Clint paused, running his hand through his hair. He knew she was right. The warehouse wasn't some kind of secret treasure trove of answers. It was a well-protected site, likely crawling with the kinds of people they'd been fighting against. There was no way they could just show up, guns blazing. This was going to take finesse. "We'll scope it out first," Clint replied, his tone firm. "Find a weak point in their security, something we can use to our advantage. We go in, get the intel, and get out." Rachel nodded, but Clint could see the hesitation in her eyes. She was worried. He could feel it too. This wasn't the same as before. This wasn't a standard mission. The closer they got to the heart of the conspiracy, the more dangerous things became. Every move they made could have serious consequences. "All right," she said finally, her voice resolute. "We'll play it your way. But one thing, Clint, you need to understand something." Clint looked up, surprised by the intensity in her voice. "What's that?" Rachel met his gaze, her expression hard. "We don't know who we can trust anymore. Not even the guy who's supposed to be helping us. This could be a trap." Clint exhaled slowly, staring at her. He had been thinking the same thing. But there was no going back now. If they didn't take action, they'd be sitting ducks. And the longer they waited, the more likely it was that they'd be caught off guard. "I know," he said quietly, But right now, we don't have a choice. We have to find out who's behind all this. We have to put a stop to it before it spirals out of control. Rachel's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. They both knew the stakes. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about stopping something far bigger than either of them. The warehouse wasn't far from where they had set up camp. It was tucked away on the outskirts of the city, in a part of town that looked like it hadn't seen daylight in years. The place was dark, dilapidated, the kind of building that screamed danger to anyone who was smart enough to recognize it. Clint and Rachel parked a few blocks away and made their way on foot, sticking to the shadows. They didn't want to risk drawing any attention, especially not from the people they were about to face. "We'll need to be fast," Clint murmured, scanning the area. "We don't know how many people are inside, but we know they're not just going to let us walk in." Rachel nodded, her eyes sharp. She was in full-on mission mode now, her fear replaced by a steady resolve. It was one of the things Clint admired most about her, her ability to push through even when everything around her was falling apart. They crouched behind a stack of old crates, peering around the corner to get a better look at the warehouse's entrance. There was a single guard standing by the front door, and Clint could see the faint glow of cameras monitoring the area. He scowled. "Too tight a security," he muttered. "We'll have to find another way in." Rachel scanned the building, her eyes narrowing. "There's a back entrance. Small, but it's got no cameras." Clint followed her gaze. She was right. It was risky, but it was their best option. He nodded, motioning for her to follow him as they moved stealthily toward the back of the building. As they approached the door, Clint checked his weapon, making sure it was ready just in case things went sideways. He knew they couldn't afford to make a mistake. One wrong move, and everything could go south. With a silent nod, Rachel reached for the door handle. It was locked, but that was nothing Clint couldn't handle. He pulled out his lockpicks and set to work, his fingers moving with practiced precision. The lock clicked open after only a few seconds, and they slipped inside, blending into the shadows. The interior of the warehouse was as grim as the exterior, filled with crates and industrial equipment that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The silence in the air was almost oppressive, but Clint couldn't afford to be distracted. "We need to find the control room," Clint whispered, his voice low. "That's where they'll have the intel on what's really going on." They moved quickly through the dark hallways, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust covering the concrete floors. Every door they passed could be hiding a new danger, but Clint kept his focus. He knew the risks, but at this point, the only thing that mattered was finding answers. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a heavy steel door at the back of the warehouse. A security keypad was mounted on the wall next to it, but it looked old, probably easy to bypass. Clint stepped forward, ready to hack the keypad when Rachel suddenly stopped him. Her eyes widened, her hand reaching for his arm. "Do you hear that?" she asked in a whisper. Clint froze, his heart skipping a beat. At first, he didn't hear anything, but then it came to him, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was like footsteps, but not quite. Before Clint could react, the door to the control room slammed open, and a group of armed guards poured out into the hallway. Clint's blood ran cold. They'd been caught. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The moment the guards appeared, Clint's instincts kicked into overdrive. Adrenaline coursed through his veins, sharpening his senses. The odds had just shifted dramatically, and they were no longer the ones in control. This was no longer about stealth or subtlety. It was about survival. Clint grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her into the nearest alcove behind a stack of metal crates. They both held their breath, trying to remain as silent as possible. The sound of boots on concrete echoed in the hallway, signaling that the guards were getting closer. Clint could hear the low hum of their radios crackling, but their voices were muffled. Good. It gave them a few seconds. Rachel's eyes were wide, her breath shallow, but she didn't say a word. Clint knew what she was thinking. They had to act fast, or they'd be cornered. There was no way they could fight their way through this many people. It was time to get creative. Clint's mind raced. They needed a distraction. Something to throw the guards off course long enough to get out of this alive. But what? His eyes flicked to the various crates, stacked high around them. He had an idea. He motioned to Rachel, silently signaling her to stay put. Then, in a swift, calculated movement, he reached for a nearby crate, moving it just enough to make a loud scraping noise. The sound was like a bolt of lightning, ringing through the otherwise silent warehouse. Clint's heart skipped as the guards instantly turned in their direction. It worked. They were distracted, just enough for Clint to make a move. In the split second before the guards started rushing toward them, Clint grabbed Rachel's arm again, pulling her down the narrow hallway toward the back exit. They had no time to hesitate. They sprinted, each step reverberating with the pounding of their hearts. Behind them, the guards shouted, but Clint didn't dare look back. They had only one goal now: escape. They reached the door leading to the alleyway, but it was locked. Clint cursed under his breath. Of course it was. They weren't going to make it out that easily. Rachel didn't hesitate. She grabbed a metal pipe lying on the ground and swung it at the door handle with all her strength. The door buckled slightly, but it wasn't enough to break it open. "Clint, we're running out of time." Rachel's voice was urgent. Clint's mind raced. There had to be another way. He quickly scanned the alley, trying to spot anything that could help them. His eyes landed on a fire escape ladder attached to the side of the building. It was a long shot, but it was their best option. "Up there!" Clint shouted, pointing to the fire escape. "Now!" Without a word, Rachel bolted toward the ladder, Clint right behind her. The guards' shouts were growing louder, but they didn't have the luxury of waiting. Rachel reached the base of the ladder first and began to climb, her hands gripping the rungs with practiced speed. Clint followed, his own hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline coursing through his body. They reached the top just as the first guard appeared at the bottom, his weapon drawn. But it was too late. They had gained some distance, and now they were out of the immediate danger zone. At least, for the moment. Clint looked around. The roof of the warehouse was flat and wide, offering no cover, but it did give them a view of the entire area. The city stretched out in front of them, the dark skyline a stark contrast to the chaos below. "We need to move fast," Clint said, his voice low. "The guards will be on the roof any second now." Rachel nodded, but Clint could see the strain in her eyes. They were exhausted, and the tension of being hunted was starting to wear on her. He couldn't afford to let it show. He had to stay focused. "Do you see anything?" Rachel asked, scanning the surroundings for any kind of escape route. Clint's eyes scanned the roof. There was a vent near the edge of the building, but it looked small, too small to fit through. But then his gaze landed on something better: a large water tank, perched on a platform on the far side of the roof. It was low enough to the ground that they could potentially climb down from there, but it would be a risky move. "We're going for the water tank," Clint said, pointing toward it. "We'll drop down to the alley and head for the exit." Rachel hesitated for a moment, but then she nodded. There was no time to argue. They made their way quickly across the roof, staying low and out of sight. The sound of their footsteps was drowned out by the wind, but Clint knew the guards would be closing in soon. They couldn't afford to be caught here. As they reached the edge of the roof, Clint peered down. The drop wasn't far, but it was enough to make him hesitate for just a second. He looked over at Rachel. Her expression was set, determined. She was ready. Clint took a deep breath and jumped. His feet hit the ground with a hard thud, and he staggered for a moment to steady himself. Rachel landed next to him, equally quick to recover. They didn't waste time. They bolted down the alley, trying to stay in the shadows as much as possible. But as they rounded a corner, Clint's heart sank. Standing at the end of the alley were two more guards. "Not good," Rachel muttered under her breath. Clint cursed. They had nowhere to go. They were trapped. "Clint, we need to fight our way out," Rachel said, her voice steady but urgent. Clint's mind raced. He didn't want to fight, not with their limited resources and time. But if they didn't act fast, they'd be captured or worse. He turned to Rachel. "We make it fast. Get to the car. I'll handle the rest." Rachel nodded, a flash of determination in her eyes. Clint had no time to explain. They both knew what had to be done. Clint stepped forward, positioning himself between Rachel and the guards. His hand hovered over his gun, ready to draw. The alleyway felt like a trap, each step they took reverberating off the cold concrete, closing in on them. Clint could feel the air thickening, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his chest. The two guards standing at the far end of the alley were no mere distractions. They were soldiers, trained and ready to end this chase once and for all. Clint's mind was racing. His hand hovered over his weapon, but he didn't want to make the first move, not yet. He needed to understand the situation. The guards were clearly aware of their presence, but they hadn't made a move to attack just yet. They were waiting. It was almost as if they were trying to gauge how far Clint and Rachel would go before making their own move. Rachel shifted next to Clint, her breathing steady despite the danger. "We don't have much time, Clint. They'll call for reinforcements. We need to make a choice, fight or run." Clint's jaw tightened. He didn't like either option. Running would mean being hunted down until they were eventually cornered. He couldn't let that happen. But fighting? The odds were stacked against them. Even with their skills, the chances of surviving a full-on gunfight in the alley were slim. "Stay calm," Clint murmured, his voice low but firm. "We're going to make this work. Trust me." Rachel nodded, but Clint could see the worry behind her eyes. They both knew the risks. It wasn't just about survival anymore. They had to stop whatever shadowy organization was pulling the strings, and that meant getting out of this alive. The guards didn't speak, but their eyes narrowed as they inched forward, clearly calculating their next move. Clint's instincts flared. They were giving him an opening, but he didn't know how long it would last. Then, as if sensing Clint's hesitation, one of the guards stepped forward, lifting his weapon in Clint's direction. The moment had come. There was no more time to think. In one fluid motion, Clint drew his gun and fired, the sharp crack of the gunshot splitting the silence. The first guard crumpled to the ground, but the second guard didn't flinch. He returned fire immediately. The bullet missed by mere inches, grazing Clint's arm. "Damn it," Clint muttered under his breath, his mind already working. The situation had just gone from bad to worse. The guard who had fired was now rushing toward them, aiming to close the distance. Clint and Rachel needed to act fast. "Move," Clint shouted, grabbing Rachel's arm and pulling her forward just as the second guard took another shot. The bullet whizzed past them, embedding itself in the brick wall behind them. Clint could feel the adrenaline surging through him, sharpening his focus. The alley was narrow, leaving them with little cover, but it also meant the guard was closing in fast. They couldn't stay here much longer. They darted to the side, weaving between the narrow gaps between the buildings. The guard followed, but Clint was already thinking 2 steps ahead. They needed to turn the tables. Clint reached the corner of the building and shoved Rachel out of the way, using his body to shield her from another shot that rang out. He caught a glimpse of the guard's shadow just as he rounded the corner, gun raised. Clint acted on instinct, grabbing a nearby metal pipe and swinging it with all his might. The guard didn't expect it. The pipe connected with the guard's head with a sickening thud. The man dropped to the ground, knocked unconscious. For a moment, all Clint could hear was the harsh sound of his breathing and the rush of blood pounding in his ears. Rachel, her face pale but determined, looked up at Clint. He's out cold. We don't have time to wait around." Clint pulled her along once more, back toward the alley's exit. They couldn't afford to stay in this area. The noise from the gunfight would have drawn attention, and they needed to move fast before reinforcements showed up. Clint and Rachel moved quickly, darting through the maze of backstreets. Every step was calculated, but their path grew more erratic as they encountered dead ends and more obstacles. Clint could feel his heart pounding harder with each turn, and he knew Rachel was struggling to keep up. But there was no time to slow down, not when they had no idea how many people were after them. They didn't speak much as they ran. They didn't need to. Clint could read the urgency in Rachel's every movement. She was just as determined as he was to get out of this mess alive, and to uncover the truth behind all of this. As they turned another corner, Clint caught sight of a familiar street, one that led to their car. He exhaled in relief, but his body was far from relaxed. The worst part wasn't over, but as they reached the car, Clint's stomach dropped. A black SUV was parked right in front of it. "Shit," Rachel hissed, pulling Clint into the shadows of the alley. It's them. They found us. Clint's mind raced. He had no idea how they'd been tracked so quickly. He checked his phone, scanning for any sign of a GPS signal or tracking device. Nothing. But they had to have known where they were. Someone must have tipped them off. All right, Clint said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside his mind. We make a run for it. Head for the back alley. I'll take care of the SUV. Rachel nodded quickly, her expression tight with determination. She wasn't about to back down now. Neither of them was. Without a word, they sprinted toward the back of the car. Clint kept his eyes on the SUV, watching for any movement. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. Clint reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device, a flashbang grenade. He wasn't fond of using weapons like these, but they had no choice. The element of surprise was all they had left. Cover your ears, Clint shouted, pulling the pin on the grenade and throwing it underhand toward the SUV. The explosion of light and sound was deafening. Clint shielded his eyes, even as he felt the heat of the blast. The SUV's windows shattered, and the vehicle rocked on its wheels. In the confusion, Clint grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her toward the car. But as he opened the door and pushed her inside, a new sound cut through the chaos, the unmistakable sound of sirens. They had to go. Now, the sirens wailed in the distance, a constant reminder that time was running out. Clint slammed the car door shut, his mind racing with the consequences of what they'd just done. They were no longer just running from the operatives. They were now fugitives in the eyes of the law. Clint, we need to move, Rachel said, her voice urgent, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. They'll be here any minute. Clint's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't need to be told twice. He floored the gas pedal, sending the car screeching down the alley and into the narrow street. The tires burned against the pavement as he expertly weaved between traffic, trying to put as much distance between them and the approaching law enforcement. The engine roared, the car slicing through the night like a predator on the hunt. Clint's pulse matched the rhythm of the speeding car, his every sense heightened. He had been in high-stakes chases before, but this felt different. Every turn, every corner they rounded, brought them closer to capture, or worse. Rachel was silent, her face pale, but Clint could see the determination in her eyes. She had always been calm under pressure, but even she couldn't hide the tension in her muscles. The weight of their situation had hit her too. They weren't just running from criminals anymore. They were running from everyone. Do you have a plan? She asked, breaking the silence. I've got a few tricks up my sleeve, Clint replied, glancing at her for a split second. But we need to make sure we're not being tracked. Rachel's eyes widened. Are we being tracked? Clint didn't answer immediately. He had no idea how they were being located so quickly. His mind churned, but for now, survival was the priority. Just keep an eye out, Clint said. If we make it through the city, we'll have a chance. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, watching as the flashing red and blue lights drew closer. His chest tightened. He knew the law wasn't their biggest problem tonight. It was the shadowy organization that wanted them dead. The authorities were a temporary problem. The real threat was still hunting them. Without warning, Clint swerved onto a side street, cutting off the path of a squad car that had been tailing them. The tires screamed in protest as he turned sharply, the car barely maintaining control as it shot down an even narrower road. Rachel gasped, "Clint!" But Clint didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. His instincts guided him now, his years of experience as a law enforcement agent kicking in. He knew how to lose a tail, how to disappear in plain sight. It was his only advantage in this moment. They tore through residential streets, zigzagging in and out of alleyways. The headlights from the squad cars grew more distant, and Clint allowed himself a brief moment of relief. But that relief was short-lived. "Clint!" Rachel's voice was sharp, panic rising in her tone. Up ahead. Clint's heart stopped. In the distance, he could see a roadblock. A line of police vehicles stretching across the street. There was no way around it, and they were getting closer by the second. "Hold on," Clint shouted, slamming on the brakes and jerking the steering wheel to the right. The car lurched to the side, swerving narrowly between two parked cars before it collided with the sidewalk. The tires screeched as the car drifted to a stop just inches away from a utility pole. Clint's breath came in ragged bursts as he quickly assessed their situation. The roadblock was still ahead, and they had no way of getting through. Their options were running out fast. "Are we trapped?" Rachel asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "Not yet," Clint muttered, his mind spinning. "Get ready to move." Before Rachel could ask another question, Clint threw open the car door and bolted out of the vehicle. He motioned for Rachel to follow, and without hesitation, she jumped out, her feet hitting the ground with a soft thud. They sprinted down the alley behind the car, hoping the darkness would shield them long enough to slip past the roadblock unnoticed. Clint's pulse hammered in his ears, his muscles burning from the sudden burst of exertion. As they turned a corner, Clint caught sight of the roadblock. Police officers were everywhere, some on foot and others behind their cars, all searching for them. But the two of them were already far enough away, hidden by the maze of alleys. "We've got to find another way out of here," Clint said, glancing around for any other escape routes. "We can't stay in this neighborhood." Rachel was already a few steps ahead, her keen instincts matching his own. She pointed to a fire escape ladder leading up to the roof of a nearby building. "Climb," Clint said, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward it. "Now." They scrambled up the ladder, hearts pounding in their chests, each step bringing them closer to the safety of the rooftops. Clint reached the top first, pulling himself up with ease. Rachel followed closely behind, her breath coming in quick gasps as she climbed. Once they were both on the roof, they paused to catch their breath, the cold night air washing over them. They could still hear the sirens wailing in the distance, but they were safe for the moment. "We need to figure out where to go next," Clint said, his voice low. "We can't just keep running." Rachel nodded, her face streaked with exhaustion. "I know, but where?" Clint's mind raced. They needed a place where they could lie low and regroup, but they also needed information, answers. There was still so much they didn't know about the people chasing them, and Clint wasn't going to let it end like this. "There's a safe house I know of," Clint said, finally coming to a decision. "It's outside the city. We'll regroup there and figure out what our next move is." Rachel's eyes flickered with recognition. "The one in the hills?" "That's the one," Clint replied, glancing around to make sure no one was following them on the rooftops. "Let's move before the heat gets worse." Together, they made their way across the roofs, taking care to avoid any areas where they might be spotted. They knew that time was slipping away, and the longer they stayed in the city, the more likely it was that the authorities, and their enemies, would catch up to them. As they neared the edge of the rooftops, Clint could see the glow of the safe house lights in the distance. It felt like a beacon of hope, but Clint knew the road ahead was still dangerous. They were far from safe, and the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous the game would become. The trip to the safe house felt like an eternity. Every bump in the road, every passing shadow seemed like an omen. Clint's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror for any signs of pursuit. The car's engine hummed steadily, but Clint knew that it wasn't the engine he had to worry about. It was everything else. The safe house was supposed to be a sanctuary, isolated, secure, a place where they could lie low, regroup, and figure out their next move. But as Clint and Rachel neared the outskirts of the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The closer they got, the more exposed they felt. "We're almost there," Clint muttered under his breath, though the words held little comfort. Rachel sat beside him, her gaze flickering nervously between the road ahead and the darkness of the woods on either side. She hadn't said much since their escape from the city, but Clint could see it in her eyes. The weight of the danger they were in was starting to take its toll. "How much further?" Rachel asked, breaking the silence. "Just a few more miles," Clint replied. "But don't let your guard down." Rachel nodded but didn't speak. Clint could feel the tension between them. Both of them were trapped in their own thoughts, trying to process the chaos that had unfolded in the last few days. It had all started so simply. A routine operation gone wrong, and now they were on the run, hunted by forces they didn't fully understand. Clint's mind kept circling back to one question. Who was pulling the strings? The road stretched out before them, winding through dense trees and hills. The only sounds were the rhythmic hum of the car and the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. It was quiet, eerily quiet. Too quiet. We should have been there by now, Rachel said, her voice tinged with concern. Clint's heart skipped a beat. I know. Something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He'd been trained to sense danger before it fully materialized, and right now, the hairs on his neck were screaming. Just as he was about to speed up, the headlights of another car flashed behind them. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, another driver on the same road. But then the car accelerated, closing the gap quickly. They're following us, Clint said, his voice hardening. Get ready. Rachel's body tensed beside him, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon hidden beneath her jacket. Clint didn't look back. He focused on the road ahead, trying to keep his mind sharp and his reactions quicker than the threat behind them. The pursuing car was getting closer now, its headlights blinding them as it closed in on the rear bumper. Clint could see the shape of it, a black SUV, the same kind of vehicle the operatives had been driving earlier. They weren't just tailing them, they were closing in for the kill. Clint floored the gas pedal, sending the car lurching forward. The engine roared, and they tore down the road at breakneck speed, the trees blurring past them. The black SUV mirrored their every move, staying just behind them, gaining ground with every passing second. They're not giving up, Rachel said, her voice strained as she looked over her shoulder. I don't plan on giving up either, Clint replied. Hold on tight. He swerved sharply, taking a corner at full speed. The tires screeched, and the car slid dangerously close to the edge of the road. The SUV followed, maintaining its pursuit with ruthless precision. Clint's grip tightened on the wheel. He needed to shake them off, fast. Ahead, he saw a steep incline leading to a narrow bridge that crossed over a deep ravine. It was risky, but it was their only shot. Get ready, Clint said, his voice steely. He steered the car toward the bridge, the tires spinning as they accelerated toward the narrow path. Rachel braced herself, her heart pounding. She could feel the pressure building, the walls closing in. They had to make it. If they didn't, it would be the end. Just as they reached the edge of the bridge, Clint slammed the car into high gear, aiming to use the momentum to fly over the gap. The car soared through the air for a split second, the ground disappearing beneath them. Time seemed to freeze as they hurtled toward the other side. With a violent crash, the car landed, its tires skidding across the rough pavement on the other side. Clint slammed the brakes, the car jerking to a stop just inches from the edge of a steep drop. The SUV wasn't far behind. We need to move now, Clint shouted as he threw open the door and jumped out of the car, Rachel following suit. They didn't have time to waste. The black SUV screeched to a halt behind them, and Clint knew the operatives would be out and in pursuit within seconds. They didn't hesitate. They dashed into the woods, their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. The night was cold, and the sounds of the forest were sharp and unfamiliar. But Clint's instincts guided him as he pushed forward, weaving through the trees, Rachel close on his heels. We can't outrun them forever, Rachel gasped, but Clint didn't slow down. We don't have to outrun them, Clint said grimly. We just have to make them think we did. He led them further into the woods, taking sharp turns and using the terrain to his advantage. His years of training kicked in, each step calculated, each movement designed to cover their tracks. The sound of their pursuers grew faint, and Clint knew they had gained some ground. After what felt like an eternity, Clint stopped, turning to face Rachel. He motioned for her to stay quiet as he listened carefully. There was no sign of the SUV yet, but they weren't out of danger. Clint pulled out a small device from his jacket pocket, a tracking jamming tool. He activated it, hoping it would disrupt the tracking devices the enemy might be using. It won't be long before they figure out we're off the trail, Clint said. But it'll buy us some time. Rachel nodded, but her expression remained tense. What do we do now? We head to the safe house, Clint said, his voice determined. We're not going down without a fight. Not this time. Clint and Rachel crouched low behind the thick brush, barely able to catch their breath. The sound of the distant SUV engines roared in the night, but it wasn't getting closer. For now, they were safe. For now. Clint exhaled slowly, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. The safe house was only a few more miles away, but the journey ahead felt like an eternity. With every passing minute, they were at risk of being found. They were running out of options. "They'll come for us," Rachel whispered, her voice a mix of frustration and fear. "They won't stop until they have us." Clint didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing. He knew they had to get to the safe house, but that didn't mean they were safe there. If anything, it might be a trap. "We can't keep running, Rachel," Clint said finally, his voice low. "We need answers. If we're going to get out of this, we need to find out who's behind all of this and why they want us dead." Rachel nodded, though the doubt in her eyes was hard to ignore. "And what do you propose we do? Confront them head-on?" Clint shook his head, his jaw tightening. "No, we need to gather information first. Then we'll make our move. But I need you to trust me." Rachel gave a small nod, but Clint could see the skepticism in her eyes. She trusted him before, but this was different. This wasn't just about surviving. They were tangled in something much bigger than they could have imagined. He took a deep breath and then nodded toward the distant glow of a house, barely visible through the trees. "The safe house. We move out in 5 minutes," Clint said. "We'll get there, regroup, and figure out what's next. But we need to be careful. We can't afford to make any mistakes now." Rachel glanced at him, a determined look in her eyes. "Got it." They moved swiftly through the trees, avoiding any paths that might lead to danger. The shadows around them felt oppressive, but Clint refused to let fear slow him down. He had been in dangerous situations before. He'd faced down killers, criminals, even corrupt officials. But this felt different. There were too many unknowns, and Clint knew that with every step they took, they were getting closer to the heart of something sinister. Minutes passed, and they reached the edge of the woods. The safe house came into view, a small, unassuming cabin nestled at the base of a rocky hill. The lights were dim, but the windows were clear, showing no signs of activity inside. "This is it," Clint said quietly. "Stay sharp." They approached the front door carefully, Clint leading the way. The house looked abandoned, but Clint knew better than to trust appearances. He tried the door handle. Locked. "Stay here," Clint whispered, signaling for Rachel to wait. He moved to the side of the cabin, where a small, hidden entrance had been used before. He pulled a set of lockpicks from his jacket and set to work. Rachel stood a few steps away, her eyes scanning the dark woods around them. Every sound made her jump, every whisper of wind seemed like a threat. She hated this feeling, the sense that danger was always just a heartbeat away. Clint didn't take long. The door clicked open, and he motioned for Rachel to follow him inside. The interior of the cabin was dark and musty, but it was secure. There were no signs of recent activity, no footprints or disturbances. For a moment, it felt like they had found a safe haven. Clint closed the door behind them, securing it with a heavy bolt. He moved quickly to the far corner, where an old-fashioned map of the surrounding area was pinned to the wall. He studied it for a moment, his mind working through their next move. Rachel stepped up beside him, glancing at the map. "What are you thinking?" Clint didn't immediately respond. His finger traced over the map, pausing at various points. "There are too many variables at play here," he said quietly. "I know who's after us, well, part of it anyway. But what I don't know is why." Rachel frowned. "You think this goes deeper than just us? Like, there's someone else pulling the strings?" Clint nodded slowly. "That's what I'm worried about." Just as he spoke, a sharp knock came at the door. Both Clint and Rachel froze. Clint's hand instinctively went to the gun at his side, his eyes narrowing. They hadn't been followed. He was sure of it. Another knock. This time, it was softer, almost tentative. Clint motioned for Rachel to stay quiet, and he crept toward the door, peering through a small crack in the wooden frame. His heart raced, unsure of who could be at the door. This was their safe house. They hadn't told anyone about it. Then the voice came. "Clint," the voice called softly, but urgently. "It's me." Clint's breath caught in his throat. He recognized that voice, but it wasn't one he expected to hear, especially not here. "Open up, Clint," the voice continued. "You're not alone in this." Clint quickly unbolted the door and opened it just wide enough to see the figure standing on the other side. His jaw tightened when he saw the familiar face. It was an old friend, one he hadn't seen in years. "Jared?" Clint asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jared, a former intelligence officer Clint had worked with on several cases, stood there, looking worn but relieved to see him. His face was dirty, his clothes torn, but his eyes were sharp, alert, as always. "Clint, you don't have much time," Jared said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "They know you're here. I've been tracking you ever since you left the city. You're not the only ones being hunted. There's a much bigger operation at play, and it's time we put a stop to it." Clint stared at Jared, processing what he had just heard. For the first time since all of this started, he felt a flicker of hope, but it was immediately smothered by the overwhelming weight of the danger still ahead. "What's going on?" Rachel asked, her voice low, her hand resting on her sidearm. Jared looked over at her, his expression grim. "There's an operation underway, one that has infiltrated not just the underworld, but every branch of government. And you, Clint, you're smack in the middle of it. But you're not alone. They've been watching me too. It's time to take the fight to them." Clint exchanged a glance with Rachel. He wasn't sure if this was an ally or another piece in the puzzle, but they didn't have much choice now. "Come inside," Clint said, stepping aside to let Jared in. "Tell us everything." The moment Jared stepped inside, the atmosphere in the small cabin shifted. It wasn't just the physical space that changed, it was the air itself. What had been an uneasy silence between Clint and Rachel now felt like a charged tension, the weight of the unknown hanging over them all. Jared locked the door behind him and quickly surveyed the room. His eyes landed on the map Clint had been studying earlier. Without a word, he moved over to the table and studied the map, his expression unreadable. Clint took a step forward, his voice low and cautious. "Okay, Jared, talk. You said there's something bigger going on. What do you know?" Jared didn't look up from the map. His finger traced a line over several marked locations. "I've been tracking movements for months, Clint. There's a rogue operation inside the government, one that's pulling strings in law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and even the military. Whoever's behind it has infiltrated almost every major institution." Clint and Rachel exchanged a glance, both processing the weight of what Jared had just revealed. "How deep does this go?" Rachel asked, her voice sharp. Jared paused, his finger hovering over the map. "As deep as it needs to, I'm afraid. They've got people at every level. People who are loyal to them, not to the country, not to the law. And they've been running operations in the shadows for years. They want control, Clint. Full control." Clint's jaw tightened. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed made it even worse. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about stopping something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. "Why are they targeting us?" Clint asked. "What do they want with me?" Jared finally looked up, his eyes meeting Clint's with an unsettling intensity. "You're part of a much bigger game. You and Rachel were caught in something they didn't want anyone to know about. You've seen things, Clint, things you weren't supposed to. Now they're cleaning up, and you're on their list." Rachel frowned, trying to piece together the puzzle. "What do you mean, cleaning up? What have we seen?" Jared sighed, shaking his head. "I can't explain it all right now, but trust me when I say this. You've stumbled onto something huge, and they can't afford to let you live. They need to bury the truth." Clint felt a cold chill run down his spine. He wasn't just a target. He and Rachel had become liabilities to a powerful, shadowy force. Whoever they were, they'd been covering their tracks for years, operating in the background, unseen by most people. But Clint had seen the cracks, and now the cracks were closing in on him. "Where do we go from here?" Rachel asked, her tone steady but filled with urgency. Jared ran a hand through his hair. "We need to take the fight to them. I've been gathering intel, and I have a lead on a high-level contact. Someone inside their operation. They're in a position to give us answers. But we don't have much time." Clint nodded. "Where do we find them?" Jared reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted device. He handed it to Clint. "This is the key. It's a secure channel to one of their operatives. They'll be expecting you." Rachel glanced at the device in Clint's hands, her skepticism evident. "An operative? How do we know this isn't another trap?" "We don't," Jared replied bluntly. But it's our best shot. If we don't act now, we'll lose our chance to uncover what's really going on. I've got a plan to get us to this contact, but we need to move fast. I'm not the only one who's been tracking them. Clint took the device, weighing it in his hand. There was no other choice. They had come too far to back out now. All right, let's do it. They moved quickly, leaving the safe house in a rush. Clint felt the adrenaline start to course through him again, the familiar mix of fear and determination setting in. He didn't know if he could trust Jared completely, but he didn't have the luxury of doubt. Not now. They made their way to a secluded cabin on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. It was here, Jared said, that they would make contact with the inside operative. The cabin was tucked away in a dense patch of woods, a perfect location for a clandestine meeting. Clint scanned the area as they approached, keeping his senses alert for any sign of danger. He knew the enemy would be close, watching. They wouldn't make it easy for him to get answers. When they arrived at the cabin, Jared gave a quick, precise knock on the door, followed by a strange rhythmic tap. The door opened almost immediately, and a shadowy figure stepped out. Clint's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but Jared raised a hand, signaling for calm. The figure was a woman, no older than 30, dressed in plain clothes. She had short, dark hair and a look of quiet intensity in her eyes. "You must be Clint Eastwood," the woman said, her voice low but firm. Clint nodded, trying to assess her with a single glance. "And you're the contact?" The woman gave a slight nod. "I'm Isabella. We don't have much time, so I'm going to give it to you straight. The operation you've uncovered, the one you've been running from, it's much bigger than you realize. There are people with the power to control everything from the shadows, and they've got their sights set on taking this country down from the inside." Rachel stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "What are we supposed to do about it?" Isabella's gaze flickered toward the woods, as if she was making sure they weren't being watched. "You need to stop them, Clint. All of you. You've already seen too much to walk away. They've put you in their sights because you're the ones who can stop them." Clint exchanged a quick glance with Rachel. The gravity of what Isabella was saying was beginning to sink in. They weren't just pawns in a game. They were the key to unraveling the conspiracy, to stopping the shadowy forces at play. But the question remained. Were they prepared to pay the price for it? "Let's go inside," Clint said, his voice steady, "and tell us everything." Isabella stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The door clicked shut behind them, the sense of finality hanging in the air. There was no going back now. The cabin was small, barely enough to hold the three of them, and the atmosphere inside was thick with tension. Isabella moved to the far corner and sat down at a table littered with papers and documents, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across her face. Clint and Rachel exchanged a look before Clint spoke up. "So, what exactly are we dealing with here?" Clint asked, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "This operation you're talking about, who's behind it? And why are they going after us?" Isabella took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing as if considering how much to reveal. "It's complicated," she said, her tone grim, "but I'll give it to you straight. There's a group within the government, a cabal of powerful individuals. They've been manipulating global events for years, controlling everything from law enforcement to intelligence agencies to military operations. They're known as the Collective." Rachel stepped forward, her expression hardening. "The Collective? I've never heard of them. How do they have that much control?" "They work in the shadows," Isabella replied, her voice low. "They've infiltrated every branch of government, every major institution. They use their power to shape world events, to push their own agendas. And they've been building a network for decades." Clint's mind raced as he processed this new information. A shadowy group controlling everything? It sounded like something out of a conspiracy theory, but with everything that had happened to him and Rachel, he couldn't dismiss it. "So where do we fit in?" Clint asked. "What makes us so important to them?" Isabella looked up, her eyes meeting his. "You two stumbled onto something you weren't supposed to. A project, one that was meant to stay hidden. But you saw the evidence, and that's what put a target on your back." Rachel's brow furrowed. "What project? What kind of evidence?" Isabella hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. There's a covert operation, a plan to overthrow the government and put the collective in full control. They were testing it in secret, running simulations, gathering intelligence. But they needed the right people to carry it out, people with the skills to execute it without raising suspicion. Clint's stomach tightened. And we're those people? Not exactly, Isabella said, glancing at the door, making sure they weren't being overheard. But you were close to finding out the truth. The collective didn't want anyone to know about the project, especially not you. They've been monitoring your every move. You were never meant to survive this long. Clint felt the weight of her words settle over him. He had always known there were powerful forces at play, but this was something on a whole new level. His instincts told him to trust Isabella, but the more he learned, the more questions he had. So, what's our next move? Rachel asked, her voice steady, even though her mind was clearly processing everything. Isabella stood up and grabbed a stack of papers from the table, holding them out to Clint. This is the blueprint, she said. It's the key to understanding the collective's plan. It's a combination of government protocols, high-level intel, and secret operations. If you want to stop them, you need to understand this. Clint took the papers from her, flipping through them quickly. The documents were a mix of encrypted codes, military plans, and encrypted files. It was a lot to take in, but Clint had seen enough classified material to recognize the weight of what they were holding. This is everything, he said, staring at the papers. The entire operation. And this is the smoking gun we need. Isabella nodded. Exactly. But we can't stop here. They'll come after us harder now. We need to find a way to expose the collective and bring their operations to light. But we have to be careful. They have people everywhere. Before Clint could respond, a sharp noise sounded from outside. The unmistakable sound of tires crunching on gravel. Jared's warning from earlier echoed in Clint's mind. They weren't safe here anymore. Get down, Clint ordered, his voice low but urgent. Rachel instinctively dropped to the floor, her hand reaching for her gun. Isabella moved swiftly to a nearby window, peering out through the blinds. Clint followed her, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkness outside. They're here, Isabella said, her voice tight with anxiety. Clint's hand instinctively went to the weapon at his side, but he quickly realized they were trapped. The cabin was isolated, and there was no easy way out. They had to hold their ground. We need a plan, Clint said, his mind working through their options. Is there another way out of here? Isabella nodded, her eyes flickering to the back door. There's a tunnel beneath the cabin. It leads to the woods, but we have to move fast. Clint glanced at Rachel. Ready? She nodded, her face set with determination. Let's go. Isabella quickly led them to the back of the cabin, where she pulled aside a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden hatch. She opened it with practiced ease, revealing a narrow, dark tunnel beneath the cabin. The smell of earth and damp would fill the air. Follow me, Isabella urged, dropping down into the tunnel. Clint was the last to follow, pulling the hatch shut behind him. The tunnel was cramped and winding, but it offered them the best chance of escape. They moved quickly, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the dirt and stone. Clint's mind raced as they made their way deeper into the earth. The collective was closing in, and they needed to find a way to get ahead of them. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the end of the tunnel, where a narrow exit opened up into the woods. The night air was cool and fresh, but Clint didn't allow himself to relax. They were still in danger. They were still hunted. They emerged from the tunnel and into the thick forest, their surroundings dark and quiet. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. For a moment, it felt like they had escaped, but Clint knew it was only a temporary reprieve. We need to keep moving, Clint said, scanning the area. We can't stay here. Isabella glanced over her shoulder, her face pale but determined. I know where we can go, but it's risky. The collective has eyes everywhere. Risk is all we've got left, Clint said, already heading in the direction Isabella had indicated. Lead the way. They moved swiftly through the woods, every crack of a twig underfoot sending Clint's nerves on edge. There was no telling who was watching, but Clint couldn't afford to think about that now. They had one goal: find the truth, stop the collective, and make sure they didn't become the next targets. The woods were thick, dark, and unsettling. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, casting long shadows on the ground. Clint led the way, his senses heightened. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. Isabella moved swiftly beside him, her eyes darting to the trees, ever vigilant. Rachel followed closely behind, her hand resting on her weapon, ready for anything. The path was narrow and winding, leading them deeper into unfamiliar territory. Clint had no idea where they were going. All he knew was that they had to keep moving. They were too close to something big now, and the collective would stop at nothing to bury their findings. "Where are we headed?" Clint asked, keeping his voice low. Isabella glanced back at him, her face drawn and pale from the constant pressure. "There's a safe house not far from here. It belongs to an old ally of mine. They've been keeping tabs on the collective for years. They might have more information." Rachel shot Clint a glance, but didn't say anything. She trusted Isabella, but trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. Their only goal was survival and the truth. The journey through the woods seemed endless. Every few minutes, Clint checked his surroundings, scanning for any signs of pursuit. The tension in the air was palpable, and Clint could feel the weight of their dangerous situation pressing down on him. Time was running out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a small, dilapidated cabin hidden deep in the woods. It wasn't much, just a single room, sparsely furnished, but it looked safe enough. Isabella gestured for them to go inside. The cabin was dark and quiet, but there was an unmistakable sense of secrecy about the place. Isabella moved to the corner, flipping a hidden switch in the floor. A trapdoor creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into a basement. Clint hesitated for a moment, eyeing the stairs. "What's down there?" Isabella paused. "More information, and a place to hide." Clint nodded and followed her down. The basement was cold and damp, the walls lined with shelves full of old files, maps, and photographs. The dim light flickered overhead as Isabella made her way to a desk cluttered with more documents. "This is where we've been tracking the collective's movements," Isabella said, pulling open a drawer. She handed Clint a stack of papers. "These are the records. It's everything we've been able to gather over the years. The operations, the key players, and the ones who are still active within the organization." Clint scanned the documents quickly, feeling his stomach tighten as he saw the names, the coded messages, the intricate plans laid out on the pages. He had been right all along. There was something much larger at play. A dark, insidious force working in the shadows, manipulating events and pulling strings. "This is it," Clint murmured, feeling a sense of both dread and determination settle in his chest. "This is everything." Rachel moved closer, peering over his shoulder. "What are we looking at here?" "It's a timeline," Clint said, pointing to a series of dates and locations marked on one of the documents. "The collective's operations over the past few years. They've been planting people in key positions. They're moving fast, and they're about to make their move." Isabella nodded. "We don't have much time. If they've already infiltrated as deep as we think, they're ready to make their play. And they won't stop until they have complete control." Clint set the documents down on the desk and turned to face Isabella. "We need to expose them. We need to make this public." Isabella hesitated, her expression darkening. "It's not that simple, Clint. The collective doesn't just run things from behind closed doors. They've got assets everywhere: military, government, law enforcement, even people in the media. If we go public, we might be signing our own death warrants." Rachel's eyes flicked between Clint and Isabella, her face hardening. "So what's the plan, then? We sit here and wait for them to come for us?" Isabella shook her head. "No, we act. But we have to be strategic. We can't just barge into this head first. We need to find their weaknesses, isolate their power, expose the ones who are most vulnerable." Clint rubbed his chin, considering the implications. "All right, but we don't have much time. If we wait too long, they'll come after us, and we'll never get the chance to expose them." Isabella's eyes flicked to the door, as if sensing a presence outside. "They're already here." Clint's heart raced. His instincts screamed at him to move, but they were too late. The door to the cabin flew open with a deafening crash. Figures in black tactical gear flooded the room, their weapons trained on the three of them. "Stay where you are," one of the figures barked. Clint's hand moved to his gun, but Isabella was faster. She grabbed a file from the desk, tossing it toward Clint. "Take this," she shouted. "Go." The room erupted into chaos. Clint and Rachel dove toward the trapdoor, but the soldiers were too quick. Gunfire erupted in the cabin, the sound deafening as bullets flew past Clint's head. He grabbed Rachel's arm and pulled her down into the basement just as a round ricocheted off the ceiling above them. They hit the bottom of the stairs, breathing hard. The only sound now was their own frantic footsteps and the pounding of their hearts. "Go," Clint hissed, pulling Rachel toward a small door at the back of the basement. "We can't stay here." Isabella's voice echoed from above them, frantic but calm. "The exit's to the left. Get to the second tunnel." Clint and Rachel didn't hesitate. They moved swiftly, their footsteps barely audible as they navigated through the dark, twisting tunnel beneath the cabin. They didn't know how far the tunnel stretched, but they knew it was their only chance. Behind them, the sounds of the soldiers filled the cabin, but they couldn't afford to look back. Not yet. Clint's breath came in short, sharp gasps as he ran through the narrow tunnel. The darkness around him seemed to close in, but he kept moving. The dim light from the flashlight he gripped tightly illuminated the walls just enough to keep them from becoming lost. He could hear Rachel's hurried steps behind him and Isabella's steady pace beside them, but he dared not look back. The soldiers were close, too close. Rachel's voice broke through the silence, tense and low. "How far is this tunnel, Isabella? How much longer?" Isabella, who had been leading the way, glanced back over her shoulder. "We're almost there. The exit's just ahead. But once we're out, we're in uncharted territory. We don't know who or what will be waiting for us." Clint's mind raced. They were running out of time, and they still didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle. The collective had orchestrated this entire operation with ruthless precision, and if they didn't find the final piece soon, they'd never be able to stop it. Ahead, the tunnel widened, and Clint could see the faint outline of another door. His pace quickened, and he reached for his gun, his finger tightening around the trigger. He didn't expect to find anyone at the exit, but in their world, nothing was certain. Isabella pushed the door open with a soft creak, revealing a small room that looked like it had been abandoned for years. Dust coated the floors, and cobwebs clung to the corners, but the room seemed safe enough, for now. "We need to regroup and plan our next move," Isabella said as she shut the door behind them. "But we're not out of the woods yet. The collective won't stop hunting us." Clint nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He glanced down at the documents Isabella had handed him earlier, still clutched tightly in his hands. They were filled with information, names, locations, codes, but one detail had stuck out like a sore thumb. A date, a specific time, and the location of a meeting that could change everything. "We need to get to Washington," Clint said, his voice steady but urgent. "There's a meeting scheduled for tomorrow. If we get there before they do, we can stop whatever they have planned." Isabella's eyes flickered with hesitation. "I don't know, Clint. This is too dangerous. We don't even know who's going to be there. They could have anyone in that room." "We don't have a choice," Clint shot back. "If we wait, it's over. We have to get to that meeting. It's the last chance we have to take them down." Rachel, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "He's right. This could be it, the final piece we've been looking for. If we expose them here, it all falls apart." Isabella took a deep breath, clearly weighing their options. "Fine, but we need to be smart about this. No mistakes. We go in, we get the intel, and we get out. Fast." Clint nodded. "Agreed. Let's move." The drive to Washington was tense. The night had fallen completely by the time they reached the outskirts of the city. Clint could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. Every passing car, every shadow seemed to be an enemy, and he knew they were being hunted. But they couldn't turn back now, not when they were so close. They arrived at a rundown hotel just outside of the city, its neon sign flickering weakly in the distance. It was the perfect place to lay low for a few hours, plan their next move, and figure out exactly how they would infiltrate the meeting. Clint had always been good at thinking on his feet, but this time felt different. The stakes had never been higher. If they failed, it wasn't just their lives on the line. The entire world could fall under the collective's control. Isabella led them to a room at the back of the hotel, a small, nondescript space with a single bed and a desk cluttered with papers. It was clear that they weren't here for comfort, only for survival. Clint set the documents on the desk and started going over the details again. He was looking for something he had missed before, something that could give them the edge they needed. He needed to see the bigger picture, to understand how everything connected. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes scanning the papers beside Clint. "This feels like a trap," she said quietly. "We're walking right into their hands." Clint didn't look up. "That's exactly what they want us to think. But they won't expect us to show up. We have the element of surprise." Isabella was pacing in the corner, her mind clearly working through the same thoughts. "We can't afford to underestimate them. If they're expecting us, they'll have already made arrangements. They'll have backup waiting." Clint closed his eyes for a moment, focusing on the information in front of him. Then, his eyes snapped open. "Here it is," he muttered. Rachel leaned forward. "What?" "This date," Clint said, pointing to a specific entry in the document. "The collective's meeting tomorrow. It's not just a regular gathering. It's scheduled right after a high-level briefing at the Pentagon. The key players will be in that room, the ones with real power, and they're going to discuss the final stages of the operation." Isabella frowned. "And you think they're going to reveal everything in front of everyone?" Clint shook his head. "No, but they'll let something slip. They always do. And once we have that, we can blow the lid off this thing." Rachel's jaw tightened. "How do we get in, though?" Clint stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened streets of Washington. "We don't go through the front door. We find a way in from the inside." He turned to Isabella, his mind already working out the logistics. "You've been tracking them for years. Do you know anyone inside the government who can help us get access to that meeting?" Isabella hesitated for a moment. "I know someone, but it's risky. The last time we contacted them, they went silent. They could be compromised." Clint's eyes hardened. "We don't have time to waste. We make contact and we do it now." As he pulled out his phone, he felt the weight of the situation hit him once more. The collective's grip on power was tightening, and they were running out of time. Tomorrow would be make or break. Clint's hand trembled ever so slightly as he dialed the encrypted number. His mind raced, running through the worst-case scenarios. Every time they'd pushed forward, they'd found more enemies, more walls closing in. But now, this was the final chance. They couldn't afford to fail. Isabella paced the room, her sharp eyes never leaving Clint as she waited for the call to connect. "If this goes south, we're all dead," she said, her voice steady but laced with tension. "I know," Clint replied, his voice low, "but if we don't do this, the collective wins, and everyone else loses." Rachel stood near the door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching the street outside. "We've been cornered before. We can't let them control the narrative anymore. They think they're untouchable." Clint nodded. "Exactly." The line clicked, then a voice crackled through the speaker. "Clint? It's Carter. I didn't expect you to call." Clint's pulse quickened. Carter was an old ally, someone Clint had worked with in the past, someone who had connections deep within the government. He'd always been a bit of a wild card, but Clint needed him now more than ever. "I need access to the meeting tomorrow. The collective's briefing. I know it's high security, but we have to get in," Clint said, cutting straight to the point. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "Are you out of your mind? You know what you're asking, right? That's a room full of the most dangerous people in the world." Clint's jaw tightened. "I know, but they're planning something big, and if we don't stop them now, it's over." "I'm not sure I can pull this off," Carter muttered, and Clint could hear him pacing. "But all right, I'll make some calls. You'll need to be in by tomorrow, no later than 9 a.m. I'll give you the entry code and coordinates to bypass the security checkpoint. You're on your own after that." Clint exhaled sharply. "Thanks. We won't let you down." The line went dead. Rachel pushed away from the wall, moving toward Clint. So we have an in. What next? Clint's eyes were hard, focused. We get to that meeting, and we find out exactly what they're planning. The next morning, they made their way to the designated location, a sleek government building that loomed above them like a fortress. Every inch of the structure screamed power. High-tech security, layers of defense that would have kept out anyone who wasn't supposed to be there. But Clint wasn't just anyone. The entry code that Carter had given them was nothing more than a string of digits, a secret key that unlocked the back door of the building. The closer they got, the more the air seemed to crackle with energy, like a storm was about to hit. "This is it," Clint muttered, looking at the security checkpoint ahead. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. Rachel checked her weapon one last time, and Isabella glanced around, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Remember," Isabella warned, her voice low, "we're in hostile territory now. One wrong move, and we'll be in the middle of a firefight." Clint nodded. "Keep it cool. No heroics. We get in, get the intel, and get out." They reached the security checkpoint, and Clint swiped the keycard Carter had provided. The door beeped, and with a soft click, it swung open. A narrow hallway led them further into the building, the sterile, clinical environment making Clint's skin crawl. They passed multiple locked doors, each one a reminder of just how high the stakes were. "Stay sharp," Clint whispered as they made their way down the hallway. "We're almost there." At the end of the corridor, a large door stood ominously in front of them. This was it, the meeting room where the final piece of the puzzle lay. Clint's heart pounded in his chest. They couldn't afford to be discovered now. Isabella placed a hand on the doorknob, but Clint held her back. "Wait, there's something off about this." She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Clint scanned the hallway, his instincts telling him that they weren't alone. "They're expecting us." Before anyone could respond, the door burst open, and armed guards flooded into the corridor, blocking their escape route. "Don't move," one of them shouted, leveling his weapon at Clint. Clint's mind raced. There was no time to think. He reacted instinctively, drawing his gun. But the guards were already closing in, their weapons raised. "This is it," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the tension. "We're not walking out of here." Clint's gaze darted to Isabella, who was already making her move. She dove for cover, rolling behind a column just as gunfire erupted. Clint shot at one of the guards, knocking him back, but more kept coming. They were trapped. "Isabella, get to the control room," Clint yelled, covering her retreat. She nodded without hesitation, sprinting toward a door at the far end of the hallway. "We're not done yet." Clint followed her lead, but as they ran, the guards tightened their grip. They were cornered, and worse still, they knew they weren't going to make it out alive unless they could make one final move. "Rachel," Clint shouted, his voice urgent, "get to the conference room now." She nodded sharply and sprinted in the other direction, leaving Clint and Isabella to cover her. Clint's mind raced. The information was almost within reach. If they could just get into that room. The door to the meeting room opened slowly, and Clint pushed Isabella toward the entrance. They had one shot, one chance to take down the operation. They wouldn't let this go without a fight. The room was silent, eerily so. After the gunfire ceased, Clint's pulse was still pounding in his ears as he and Isabella moved cautiously through the narrow corridor. They had made it into the meeting room, but the danger wasn't over. Their footsteps echoed off the cold concrete floor as they carefully navigated the dimly lit space, their weapons drawn and ready. The final piece of the puzzle was within their grasp, and Clint could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Isabella paused, her eyes darting to a series of monitors lining one wall. "There it is," she whispered. "This is where it all ends." Clint nodded, moving closer to the monitors. They displayed the names and faces of several high-ranking government officials, the kind of people who controlled the country's destiny. But what caught Clint's attention wasn't the list of names. It was the countdown timer on the screen. "Shit," Clint muttered, his heart sinking. "It's starting. The operation. The final phase." Isabella's face hardened. "We have to stop it." Clint slammed his fist onto the console, triggering the system to pull up a detailed map of the operation's scope. They're launching this from several different locations across the globe. This is bigger than we thought. Rachel's voice crackled through their earpieces. Clint, we've got company, she warned. A dozen guards are closing in on your location. You need to move now. Clint swore under his breath. He knew it was only a matter of time before the collective realized what they were up to. We don't have time to waste. We need to disable the countdown. Isabella quickly started typing commands into the console, but before she could finish, the door behind them slammed open. Armed men flooded the room, weapons raised, eyes cold and calculating. You should have stayed out of this, one of the men said, his voice dripping with disdain. You've no idea what you're dealing with. Clint's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his weapon. And you've underestimated us. This ends today. Without warning, he opened fire, taking down one of the guards in a single shot. The others returned fire, but Clint, Isabella, and Rachel were already on the move, taking cover behind pillars and tables scattered around the room. The firefight erupted, a blur of chaos and noise, each shot narrowly missing its target. Isabella, hurry! Clint shouted as he ducked behind a desk. We don't have much time. She was already on it, furiously typing away at the terminal in front of her, trying to override the countdown. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but she didn't stop. The countdown continued to tick down, a reminder that failure meant the world's end. Clint fired again, taking out 2 more guards, but the numbers were growing. More soldiers were pouring into the room, their footsteps growing louder with every passing second. Done! Isabella shouted triumphantly. I've disabled the countdown. Clint's eyes flickered with hope, but the moment was short-lived. A shadow fell over him as a tall figure appeared at the doorway. It was a man Clint recognized instantly, Adrian Blackwood, the leader of the collective. He stood tall, his cold eyes glinting with amusement. Well, Blackwood said, his voice smooth and confident. I must admit, I'm impressed. You've done well to get this far. But this is where your journey ends. Clint straightened, his weapon aimed directly at Blackwood. I don't think so. You're done, Blackwood. Blackwood smirked. You think you've won? You've only delayed the inevitable. The collective's plan is already in motion. No one can stop it now. Isabella stepped forward, her voice steely. We've already stopped it. You're not the mastermind you think you are. For the briefest moment, Blackwood's composure faltered. But then, like a snake ready to strike, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small device. You've made a mistake, he said. This isn't over. You'll regret this. He pressed a button, and the room shook violently as a loud alarm blared throughout the building. Shit, what did he do? Rachel shouted over the comms. Blackwood's smirk grew wider. You've activated the failsafe. It's over. Clint's eyes widened in realization. Blackwood had triggered the final phase of the operation. The building was rigged to explode. Get out now, Clint yelled, grabbing Isabella by the arm. But Blackwood didn't give them a chance. He lunged toward Clint, knocking the gun from his hand. The 2 men tumbled to the ground, fists flying. Clint's training kicked in, and he quickly gained the upper hand, landing a solid punch to Blackwood's jaw. But the man was relentless, fighting back with a fury Clint hadn't expected. Isabella was the first to react. She rushed forward, using the butt of her gun to strike Blackwood in the back, sending him sprawling to the ground. We're leaving now. Rachel appeared in the doorway, gun raised. We don't have time to waste. Clint grabbed the device from Blackwood's hand, his fingers flying over the buttons in an attempt to deactivate the failsafe. The seconds felt like hours, and his heart pounded in his chest. Sweat streamed down his face as he worked furiously. Finally, with a click, the alarm stopped. The countdown ceased. The building was no longer on the brink of destruction. Clint let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Isabella pulled Clint to his feet. We need to move now. This place isn't safe. Clint nodded, barely believing they had done it. They had stopped the collective. They had won. As they made their way out of the building, Clint glanced back once more. He knew the battle wasn't over, not completely. The collective had been dealt a serious blow, but there would always be remnants. But for now, they had stopped the immediate threat. We did it, Rachel said, her voice quiet but filled with relief. Clint looked at his team, his eyes filled with pride. We did, and it's over. For now. But deep down, Clint knew that this victory was just the beginning. The war against the collective wasn't over. They had won this battle, but the fight would continue. And Clint would be ready. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?